Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Resilient Solar plus Storage for Cooling Centers. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group as part of our Resilient Power Project. Before I pass it over to our exciting panel of speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees today are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled here. And you can also click on that orange arrow to expand your webinar console. One thing you might like to do with your webinar console is to type in your questions and your comments. We'll be saving some time at the end of our webinar for Q&A with our panelists, and we'll get to as many as we can. So do type in your questions when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and also a PDF of the webinar slides either today or tomorrow. And we'll also be posting all of those materials on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. That's a good URL to know because it's also where we post all of our upcoming and archived webinar materials. So with that, I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague, Abby Ramanan. She will introduce the topic of our webinar, introduce our speakers, and now she's going to tell you a little bit more about Clean Energy Group.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone so much for joining us today. To provide a little background for those of you who are unfamiliar with Clean Energy Group, we are a national foundation-funded nonprofit. Our work involves providing technical assistance and policy support, as well as information sharing on clean energy topics. In our work, we partner with state and federal energy agencies, utilities, developers, and also community-based organizations. Next slide. One of CEG's biggest projects is the Resilient Power Project, which this webinar is under. The Resilient Power Project started in 2013 following Superstorm Sandy. RPP's mission is to increase access to resilient power systems, meaning solar and battery storage, in the most vulnerable communities who could be impacted by severe power outages. Next slide. So through RPP, we have supported over 250 solar and battery storage projects around the country, both through supporting active project development, as well as working with state, federal, and municipal partners to advance supportive solar and storage policies in their states and localities. Next slide. So one of the biggest ways that CEG supports solar and storage development for vulnerable communities is through the Technical Assistance Fund, or TAF, which is under RPP. Through the TAF, we provide dedicated one-on-one support to help organizations better understand the benefits of solar and storage, along with funding for a detailed solar and storage feasibility assessment for their site. Throughout the feasibility assessment process and beyond, we serve as an advisor to ensure that each organization's questions are answered and that their unique energy goals, whatever they may be, are prioritized. The TAF supports organizations that provide essential services to low-income communities, environmental justice communities, and communities of color in the event of a power outage, such as the heating and cooling centers that we're going to be talking about today. Every year we work with dozens of local and regional organizations, including municipalities, affordable housing providers, faith institutions, community-based organizations, and other nonprofit service providers. To date, we have provided over $1 million in funds with over 30 solar and storage systems installed, as well as the expansion of resilience knowledge and institutional capacity in over 100 organizations across 22 states, as well as the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and several tribal nations. My colleague, Marielle Mango, will be diving a little deeper into the TAF during her presentation, and you're also welcome to go to the link on the slide if you're interested in applying for a TAF or in supporting our critical work. Next slide. And with that, I will introduce our wonderful speakers, starting with my colleague, Marielle Mango, who is a project director at Clean Energy Group. Marielle leads the Resilient Power Project, including managing the Technical Assistance Fund and Resilient Power Leadership Initiative, which supports solar and battery storage knowledge building and capacity development for community-based organizations. Marielle's work with CEG is focused on projects that prioritize environmental justice and public health. She is a policy professional with over 7 years of experience in leading renewable energy, energy efficiency, and resilience programs. Marielle also holds a MS in environmental policy and sustainability management from the New School. We'll then have Nate Mills, who's the head of operations for American Microgrid Solutions. Nate is a program management and leadership expert with more than 2 decades of experience leading technically complex engineering efforts from design through construction. He's a former Navy officer, and his most recent work involved directing procurement and construction of submarines and their supporting systems. Following his first 10 years as a submarine officer, he held roles overseeing ship maintenance, repair, and contract management. Nate holds a naval engineer's degree with an SM in mechanical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, an MS in Earth and Planetary Sciences from the University of New Mexico, and a BS in geology from Cornell. Finally, we'll have Nicole Lim, who's the executive director for the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center. Nikki has earned advanced degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of San Francisco School of Law. She is POMO and has worked for the National Indian Justice Center and the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center since 1996. As an executive director of the CIMCC, she works to develop exhibits, educational programs, and curricular resources that represent Native American perspectives. I'm really excited to have all these awesome speakers here today. And as a reminder, feel free to start submitting your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to as many of them as we can. And with that, I will turn it over to Marielle.
Hi, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. Today's webinar is going to focus on our most recent publication, Resilient Solar and Battery Storage for Cooling Centers. I'm going to kick things off with just giving an overview of the report, some of the key takeaways that we saw before handing it over to Nate and Nikki to dive in a little deeper. So just a little bit of background of kind of how we got here. For the past couple of years, Clean Energy Group has really been prioritizing our work at the space of where energy security and public health intersect, and what that looks like, especially through a lens of building both public health and energy equity in communities. And what continuously is pointed towards is extreme heat. And what does it mean when folks don't have access to cooling in the event of extreme heat? It also could be said of times of extreme cold, having access to heat. And what happens there when power outages collide with days of extreme heat? So just some kind of, I think, key points in understanding the real breadth of the issue, that it's no longer just something that's affecting states maybe in the South or the Southwest, but extreme heat ranks #1 in general for all weather-related deaths. And the figures kind of fluctuate depending on what resource you're looking at, but the vast majority are really impacting communities of color more than they are others. And the CDC reported that 700 deaths attributed to heat in 1 year. The vast majority were identified as affecting Native American or Alaska Native populations, as well as Black individuals, way further than their white counterparts. So it's a major equity issue, and it's one that's spreading. So over 1/3 of the US population was under extreme heat this past summer. And one study predicts that that's just going to get worse, with 1/4 of the country would be in this kind of extreme heat belt that's been outlined, which would run pretty much through the South, up through the Midwest, and into parts of the Northeast. So it's a major issue, and when it collides with power outages, it's even worse, right? So US households averaged a total of 8 hours of power outages in 2020. That actually went up in 2021 and is expected to go up again in 2022. And most of those are weather related. So whereas non-weather related power outages have stayed pretty steady since 2013, weather related power outages have just continued to increase. And a lot of that can be attributed to a huge influx, right, in year after year of extreme weather, including hurricanes and things of that nature, but also through public safety power shutoffs, which are conducted by utilities. Typically in California and parts of the Northwest, it's in the event of fear that a wildfire will be sparked by utility equipment due to dry temperatures and high winds. And those outages are really impacting folks, especially medically vulnerable folks throughout California. In 2020 alone, there were 20 public safety power shutoffs in California, which resulted in almost 1 million customers losing power for an average of 32 hours. And some of those folks had outages that exceeded 5 days. So this is especially problematic for folks that have electricity-dependent medical equipment, folks that are senior or dealing with chronic illness that really rely on cooling to be able to keep themselves safe in their home. And it's a major issue. And we've seen time and time again for the past summers that when extreme heat coincides with power outages, it results in public health crises, like what happened after Hurricane Irma in Florida, as well as what we saw the prior summer in New Orleans with nursing home residents, where folks were trapped in sweltering temperatures, which resulted in major public health issues. So what can we do about it, right? Cooling centers has become a new topic of focus for emergency preparedness folks, as well as for critical community facilities that are looking to provide services to the folks that they serve regularly in order to provide cooling. So a cooling center is basically defined as an air-conditioned building that's open to the public on days of extreme heat. It could be anything from a municipal building to a library. Really, anyone can work towards being designated as a cooling center, and Nikki at CIMCC will dive further into their experience going through that. But that's the basic idea of a cooling center. And they're really instrumental in the community preparedness for planning, for emergency response and recovery, and just key to providing relief during times of high temperature, and especially important that folks actually use them. They know where they're located. They're typically, they should be located in places that people are already going, like their church or their food pantry, their local cultural center. But in the event of an outage, what happens, right? If there's extreme temperatures and these critical community facilities don't have access to reliable backup power, a cooling center isn't going to be able to provide much more support. So that's where we get to the emphasis of our report, which is how can resilient power or solar paired with battery storage support cooling center operations in the event of a power outage? And all of this is kind of without the climate, air quality, and reliability issues that come from using traditional diesel generators. We've seen time and time again that in California, for instance, the San Francisco area, they're seeing huge local air pollution issues in the event of a public safety power shutoff, because the amount of diesel generators that get turned on, it basically darkens the sky with pollution. So diesel generators are the typical go-to. People can't be blamed for going to diesel generators. It's what most people know about. But what we really wanted to look at in this report is how can solar and battery storage support these and provide economic benefits to the critical community facilities during regular grid operations, unlike a diesel generator, which just kind of, for the most part, sits there. So the report is, in addition to giving some background and some emphasis of what folks are doing around the country, really focuses on case studies. We looked at 7 facilities that were chosen based on geographic diversity and type of facility. So it ranges from community center to school to cultural center. We kind of got a bunch of different facilities in there in different regions of the country. And all the facilities that were included here, although they're not identified by name, are facilities that went through Clean Energy Group's Technical Assistance Fund, which Abby touched upon a little bit in the beginning, and I'll talk about a little bit further. But I think that's important to highlight. These are actual facilities that were assessed and that are providing real-world examples. Oh, pardon me. So some takeaways here are, I'm going to go through some trends that we saw that became really clear after the analysis. All the facilities that were assessed through this program and have been included in the case studies were assessed by American Microgrid Solutions. So it's great that we have Nate on this call today. He's going to be able to dive into some of the interesting takeaways that they saw in their work. And it's also worth noting that we didn't include any federal incentives or anything like this in the economic piece of these case studies, because everything's different. And with the changes to federal legislation, we kind of wanted to keep it as bare bones as possible. But this is a really great way of deep diving into what does the facility look like? What was their resilience goals, right? Like, are they trying to support an entire facility to be a cooling center? Are they trying to support just one room? What kind of HVAC system do they have? Do they have budgetary restrictions? Do they have an existing diesel generator that they'd like to incorporate into the system? All of these things are included as part of the case study, so you can really get an idea of an on-the-ground actual solution for solar and storage to support a cooling center. So I like to include this just as an idea of our original study results. I encourage you, if you want to dive in deeper, to check out the report. It's much more comprehensive. But you'll see that across the board, sites 1 through 7 have a negative net present value to show that the economics aren't quite there yet. Again, to highlight, we didn't include really a lot of incentives in this just to keep things based, but we're going to dive in a little bit into how economics can be improved in each state to really encourage more solar and storage development so that these kinds of facilities can actually access it. So a key takeaway that I just wanted to highlight before passing it over was really the relationship between system cost and endurance. As you can see on this slide, the duration of backup power, which is minimum, looks at about 3 hours of a minimum of 3 hours of resilient backup power. And the maximum that we looked at was 72 hours or more, right? And so somewhere in the middle there was the median for where folks fell. The interesting relationship is that for sites that are medium to small, the facilities really didn't see a huge system cost differential in the minimum endurance system, which is about 3 hours, and the maximum endurance, the higher endurance scenario, which could be 72 hours or more. And that was especially true again for the small to medium size, which were 3 through 6 and then maybe 7. So big takeaway here is that for small to medium sized facilities, which are the ones that Clean Energy Group works most through our technical assistance fund, having multiple scenarios that you can explore for what the economics of a solar and storage system looks like for a cooling facility and how it supports the HVAC system and other critical loads, it's worth looking at what is minimum and what is maximum and how really different is that price tag, because what we saw here is that it's not much and you get a lot more backup power, so more bang for your buck. Some takeaways from the report in terms of what can we do to help encourage folks to actually be able to adopt solar and storage. Number one, more technical assistance support. The vast majority of people who reach out to Clean Energy Group know that they need resilience. They're a community facility that's supporting low income or otherwise vulnerable populations. They've been combating extreme heat. They've been combating issues related to power outages. They want to make their facility more resilient so they can continue offering services when the grid's down, which can be, again, for days on end. So the first step in the door is really providing folks with one-on-one support and understanding what is battery storage, how does it work with solar, what are some case studies in your region that have been done effectively, and then helping them get their foot in the door through technical assistance programs. So Clean Energy Group really focuses again on meeting these needs that we've bulleted out here of limited staff capacity and understanding of resilient power technologies, difficult accessing, how do I even do a feasibility assessment, who do I work with, understanding what the cost looks like, the ownership structure, things of that nature. And that's why Clean Energy Group provides the Technical Assistance Fund. So for anyone who's interested, the Technical Assistance Fund provides one-on-one support to develop clean energy projects, primarily solar and battery storage, aimed at decreasing energy burdens and decreasing energy burdens and increasing resilience of critical community facilities. So it could be anything from a church to a fire station to a senior center, a school, really anything that the community would rely on for services in the event of a power outage. Our TAF program supports the preliminary technical and financial feasibility analysis to help determine size, cost, benefits. You get everything in a report of what would solar and storage look like for your facility. Grants range from $5,000 to $15,000. I would say on average, it's about $8,500 per facility to get a solar and storage feasibility assessment. And we prioritize serving low-income populations or BIPOC-led communities, and it's really meant to be an easy process. So I like to highlight low barrier to entry. Just one last overview is in addition to technical support, we've really highlighted in the report that there are other ways that states and utilities can be supporting solar and storage development at critical community facilities. I've highlighted here some state policy programs that have been really effective in getting folks to jump on board with solar and storage. Connected Solutions program in Massachusetts really is a shining star of what you can do when you're trying to incentivize solar and battery storage through revenues and incentives, adders for low-income communities, which have been implemented in other states. So I would definitely recommend folks check that out. We have a lot of reports on the CEG website outlining those. The Federal Investment Tax Credit, there have been pretty major updates to the Inflation Reduction Act this year. We're still waiting on agency guidance for next steps, but it looks like there's going to be a 30% tax credit for the next 10 years versus 26%, which it was last year, and supposed to go down to 22% in 2023. And there are so many adders in this that eligible communities like low-income communities, communities in environmental justice communities, former brownfields, former coal mining communities could see up to 70% tax credit. And also the fact that they're passing a direct pay option so that nonprofit organizations can actually access the full benefits of the solar and storage tax credit without having to kind of jump through the hoops that they have to do now with working with a third-party investor and sacrificing ownership options and things like that. So very big deal there that's going to help spur kind of across every state more solar and storage development, especially hopefully in LMI communities. And then finally, I just want to touch upon the value of resilience. We really focus a lot on monetary benefits, right? But I think limiting the benefits of solar and storage to monetary opportunities like incentives and utility bill savings makes for an incomplete analysis and an incomplete economic picture of what solar and storage can provide communities. The money saved by not experiencing an outage, or as we call it, the avoided costs of outages, represents the value of losses that would be incurred if the facility were to experience an outage. And for public health, that could really, I mean, cooling centers can reduce hospitalizations, ambulatory services, and even saves lives in the event of a power outage. So all of these things are beneficial to the community on a public health level and also have their own economic benefit. So I included a report here exploring opportunities for solar and storage in 5 southeastern cities. CEG released this in 2019, and it looked at the economics for critical facilities across 5 southeastern states for solar and storage. And the biggest takeaway from this report really is that when you factor in the value of resilience, when you create a monetary value for resilience, solar and storage made economic sense for all building types across all 5 states and all 5 cities that we looked at. So it's a really big difference, and it's something that's gaining traction in the industry and is worth keep an eye out for. If you have any questions or you'd like to learn more about the Technical Assistance Fund, please feel free to reach out to me at this email anytime. And I'll pass it over to Nate now. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. So I think I've got control here. And there we go. All right, so thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk to you about this report. My name is Nate. I work for American Microgrid Solutions, and we are a nationwide hybrid power systems developer. So day to day, we design and install power systems that include solar, storage, conventional generation, all of the above, all across the country. So this report was a natural extension of our work to look specifically at cooling centers and draw out the details of cooling centers specifically, and also outline what people really need to think about when they are trying to install resilient power for their facility. There we go. All right, so I thought it might be helpful to zoom out a little bit from not just cooling centers to general discussion of any facility and what you might think about when you are trying to design a resilient power system. And this might be helpful for facilities that are just sort of starting out in this process to say, like, where do we even stand and how do we even think about this? So a couple of caveats. One is I'm not really going to talk about the economic analysis of what happens when you're grid connected and how the battery and solar play against utility rate schedules, et cetera. That is a separate webinar and a very long discussion as well. I'm really focusing on how resilience works, right? What happens when you're off grid and you have these assets and you have these needs? How does the system perform and how would you know what to predict? The other thing that I'm not really going to talk about, like Mari mentioned, is conventional generation. That's a potential part of the mix. It's most applicable if you have a real firm need for backup power and you can't sustain the variability that comes with having solar and storage. If you're a critical facility, something like that, then you might need conventional generation, but that's not what this discussion is about. So we're going to talk about the 3 things that really matter in designing a resilient power system. And the 3 things that matter are what's shown on here. How much battery you've got, how much solar you've got, and how much load you've got, and they all matter in different ways. So we'll start in the bottom left. We'll start with the battery, because that's the foundation for what you can do with the system, whether solar is there or not. And to borrow an analogy from my friends over at New Grid Analytics, the battery is a bucket, and the battery is just a bucket that holds energy. And the bigger the bucket, the more energy you have to use for whatever you need to use it for. But what that means is that the battery is going to be the thing that sets what you would expect your worst case performance to be. Because when we're talking endurance, or sorry, when we're talking resilience, I'm going to talk about it in terms of endurance. Like, how long can the system survive? Given what it needs to do and what inputs it has, how long would you expect the system to really last? And you can think about that in two ways. One way is, what's your worst case day? On your worst case day, you're going to have high loads, you're going to have low solar input. And so the size of the battery, the size of your bucket, determines how long that system is going to survive. Another way that you can think about it is, what's your typical result? Not your worst case result, but really what would you expect, right? And that depends more on solar. Because if the battery is a bucket, solar is really the funnel that's catching energy and putting it back into the bucket. So the bigger the funnel, the more likely you are to refill the bucket every single day, be able to get through the night, and then refill it again the next day. And if you have enough solar to be able to reliably refill the battery every day, then you have a chance of having very long endurance in your typical results during an outage. So hopefully that makes sense. The battery is the bucket, the solar is the funnel, and of course what is draining out of the bucket is the load. And if you have more load required when you're supporting the community during an outage, then of course you have more capability, right? So you have more of your building operating, you can do more things, you can provide more services, but that's going to drain the battery faster. So if you have less load and you can restrict what you're doing to exactly what you need and no more, then you would expect to have longer endurance in all cases when you have an outage. We're going to talk in a little bit about your operational plan and like what you would decide to do and how you would implement it. But when you are trying to limit load, you can either do it automatically with automatic load shedding and establishment of a critical load panel, that sort of thing, or you can do it manually. And you can decide that you're going to have a plan and a checklist for someone to go around and do things and turn things on and off. Either way, the result is that if you can limit load to the minimum that you need, the solar and battery that you put into the building will last longer. And really, there are two ways to come at this problem. We usually pursue both. One way to go after this problem is to say, all right, what's the load in the building? Right? What do you expect to be able to support during this very hot weather scenario? And back into, all right, then, what does that mean for how much solar and battery you'll need? Right? And we can do it that way. We can say, all right, we know your load. We're looking at your building. You can put on this much solar and this much battery, and here's your performance goal. So here's the answer. You need this much solar and this much battery. And then you can go raise the funds for that. What happens just as often, and sometimes at the same time, is people say, we have X amount of dollars, and we want to get as much performance out of the system as we can. Right? So you start with, well, this is the most solar and battery we can get. Here's what you need to do to load, right? You need to reduce your load to half or 1/3 of what you normally use to achieve your resilience goals. And we approach the problem from both sides to come to a single configuration that meets the budget and the performance constraints. So hopefully that makes sense for zooming out and understanding really that the capacity of the battery will tell you what your worst case endurance is going to be. And the solar installation will tell you how much better your typical result will be than your worst case. And if we're talking about short durations, like you only want to survive for 12 hours, or you only want to get through the workday, when we're talking about those short durations, you're probably going to be driven much more by battery size than by solar, because there are plenty of times when the sun is not out or when solar is not producing as well as it might. In that case, battery is much more important. But if we start to talk about long durations, so 3 days or more, then the solar installation is really the driving factor in how long you can get the system to survive. Okay. So next up, we're going to talk about what the resilience results really look like. And I'm going to focus in on the graph in the upper left and just orient you to what we're looking at right now. So this is a graphic that shows you what resilience performance you can expect from this system over the course of the year. So this is this system at this site. On the y-axis is how many hours you would expect the system to survive. On the x-axis is what month of the year we're in. If you look at the shaded green area, that's the spread in the worst outcome we would expect during that month to the best outcome we would expect during that month. And the dark green line is the median result. So this is typical, what you would probably get. Half the time you'll do better, half the time you'll do worse. So that's what this graph shows you. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variability over the course of the year. Right? In January, you would expect somewhere between 4-ish and 36 hours of resilience. If you didn't adjust load, like you just let the system operate exactly how it was designed, that's the amount of spread you would see. Right? And that is driven by how much load you have on any given day and how much solar you have on any given day, because the battery size, once it's all installed, is fixed. So you have variability across seasons and variability within the day. And so that's what this graphic is showing you, and it's really important, I think, for our clients to understand how much variability there is and what the difference is between winter and summer performance. So if we're talking cooling centers, we really mostly care about June through August, and that's mostly when the cooling center will be active. And so if you restrict your view and your design criteria to just that part of the year, then you can target exactly what you want instead of doing an annual average. So now we're going to look at 2 of these facilities that we picked out of the case studies, right? This was case 4 and case 6, and one is up in the northwest, one is in the southwest. These buildings have a lot of similarities, and I picked them to compare on purpose because there's so much variability between one building to another in how much electricity it uses and what its needs are during an outage. I wanted to pick something that was mostly standardized so that we could draw out some differences. So what's similar about these is they're about the same size, 18,000 square feet. Their nominal load is about 150 megawatt hours a year. And for this part of the analysis, we assumed that both of them would shut down half of the building. So you'd have half the building operating during an outage, and we wanted them to have 24 hours of endurance as a typical result over the course of the year. So the battery is sized for that. And you can see that in both cases, on the left and the right, the worst case performance being tailored to the battery size is proportional to that battery size, right? So the one in the southwest has a slightly larger battery, so its worst case performance every month is usually slightly better than what it is in the northwest. But the big difference between these two in the summer is that the typical result is much better in the northwest than it is in the southwest. And that might be a little bit counterintuitive because you're like, well, southwest, they're going to have way higher cooling loads, but they have way more sun too. So it's not obvious how that will turn out, and you have to do the analysis every time. In this case, because the northwest has almost 3 times as much solar as the southwest facility, limited only by how much you can get on the roof, it has much better typical performance during the summer. The location of these 2 things is important somewhat, because in the northwest, you would expect to have less efficient production per kilowatt of solar installed, right? As you get to higher latitudes, you just don't get as much per year out of the solar panels. And also more of the solar production comes during the summer months for sites in the northwest than in the southwest, because the production profile is not as flat when you go far north. So for the northwest, you get over half of your production just in those 3 months of summer. And in the southwest, it's less than a third because the production profile is much flatter. But those locational differences turn out not to matter as much as the differences between particular sites. I picked these 2 sites, again, because they had similar sizes and similar electrical usage. But that electrical usage can vary by a factor of 2. So it is not, there is no thumb rule where you can say, like, for this type of building in this location, it's going to use about this much, and therefore you can walk your way forward to a system size and therefore a system cost. I wish there were thumb rules where we could extrapolate all the way to the end, but there really aren't. And just because you've looked at one microgrid or a set of microgrids, very difficult to draw inferences about what the end result is going to be and what the end cost is going to be, because there are so many variables along the way. So we have to do the analysis start to finish. Right? So that's the difference between these 2 case studies, driven by the higher amount of solar in the northwest much better typical performance during the summer, but the variability is still quite wide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about cooling centers in particular and some of the things to think about when trying to work through a cooling center. Number one is to have an operational plan. Before you engage with an installer or a microgrid architect, then you want to know what your goals are. Like, what are you trying to do? And that means, how much and how long. So how much of the building would be, what areas of the building do you expect to use? And how do you expect to use them, right? What times of day, is it going to be overnight, et cetera, et cetera. And then control of access. Are you going to shut all the doors that open normally and only use revolving doors? Make sure you don't have a door open at the front and the back so you blow all your cold air out, like that sort of thing. Airflow specific to your HVAC system and how you would control where your air handling units are pushing that conditioned air. And then set points, right? You might decide that if you're a cooling center, when you're connected to the grid, then you will keep the room at 70 degrees in the summer. And you might also say, well, we want to conserve as much energy as we can and keep the system operating when we're off grid. So if the power goes out, we're going to reset those set points to 80 degrees. It's still more comfortable than it is outside, but we're using, a third less energy than we would have otherwise, right? That sort of thing. So that kind of discussion about what you will really do when the power goes out is really important for defining what the correct critical load profile is, and therefore what performance you can expect. I'll come back to the piece about manual or automatic load shedding. One of the parts of your operational plan might be that you're going to have a person walk around and turn things off. And that's a cheaper way to shed load because it's less expensive than putting in hardware that can automatically turn things off. It's also more flexible because if the sun is out and shining and everything is good, then you can have more stuff turned on as long as you can keep the battery full at the end of the day. However, you're also relying on humans to go do things, and sometimes those are less reliable than machines to do things. So you would have to make sure you had a good plan for who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, and that you have some backup plan in place. Because the one thing we really don't want to happen is to have the power go out, the building continues to operate, and no one can adjust settings for 12 hours, and then everyone comes in to use the cooling center and it's dead. So having an operational plan for how you'll actually implement the load shedding that you want is really important. Also specific to cooling centers is that the HVAC type really matters. If you have, let's take two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum examples. In the Southeast, in that case study, there's one very large chiller that's outside. It provides cool water to the entire building, and then the air handlers blow over those cold coils. So that's one very large component that services the whole building. It can't run below a certain capacity. So when it fires up, it has a very large starting surge. That's a problem that we need to handle in the design of the microgrid. And it will draw a decent amount of power whenever it's operating. That may be less efficient if you're only trying to support part of the building, depending on how you can do zoning, than having the other end of the spectrum, which is like at our West Coast site, which happens to be Nikki's site out at CIMCC. At that facility, there are multiple rooftop units. Each of them has a zone, and each of them is individually controlled. So if we just turn off all the ones in the parts of the building that we are not using, then that's a zero on electricity use for those, instead of some of the inefficiency left over from using one large system to supply the whole building. So the type of HVAC you have matters, and it has an interaction with what parts of the building you plan to use. So coming through that discussion is a big part of what we do for each of these projects, is to figure out what's going to happen, how long it's expected to happen, and what options we have to reduce load. Zoning always helps. And if you have the opportunity to do a renovation on your building, then efficiency always wins, right? Efficiency projects will pay for themselves many times over and are a cheaper way, typically, to get more performance out of your system than building a bigger system. So if you have an opportunity to do an efficiency upgrade, that is almost always the right first answer. And that could be as simple as, one-for-one replacements of existing rooftop units. It could mean installing some mini splits because those are the most efficient way to get cooling to exactly the place you want it. There are lots of ways to look for efficiency gains that will lower the amount of load your system needs to support and therefore increase its endurance. And then last thing, building specifics make a huge difference, right? The things that really matter are the efficiency of your HVAC, like we already talked about, how secure or how well sealed the envelope of your building is. So if you have a lot of air infiltration, that's a lot more volume that you need to condition that you otherwise wouldn't. And how many windows you have in the part of the building that you're using, because solar insolation in the summer is a big driver of what your cooling load will be, right? So those things matter a lot more than where you are in the country. And that's why it takes an analysis of your particular building to figure out what the right answer is. All right, I'm going to sum up and then turn it over to Nikki. Like I said on the first slide, the battery capacity is going to drive your performance in the worst case, because that's when solar is not out, solar is not producing very well, and you have high loads, right? The battery capacity will determine how long you can survive. Solar size is important if you're talking about multi-day outages and trying to get through those outages, and it tells you how much better your typical result is going to be than your worst case result. But reducing load makes everything easier, both in terms of budget and in terms of product selection and in terms of performance. The more you can reduce load, the easier it will be for the system to reliably support what you need. Even so, the variations across seasons and within days are pretty wide. So you need to be comfortable with both the worst case scenario and what your goal is for the typical result. And setting those expectations is mostly driven by understanding what the load will be. And that takes quite a bit of time, and it takes quite a bit of discussion. And that's not something that everybody does or does well. So I would also caution you to be very wary of easy answers and quick calculators online. If you're okay with being plus or minus 50%, calculators are fine, but plus or minus 50% is a long way from knowing that you have the right answer. And when we do these analyses, we want to make sure that we're giving you something that you can rely on, as well as caveating the performance with that variability. All right, so with that, I want to leave some time for questions, so I'll turn it over to Nikki and wait for questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Nikki Lim. I am the director of the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center. We're located in Northern California, about an hour north of San Francisco. And our museum has been around since 1996. We're dedicated to educating the public about histories and cultures of California Native people, specifically from a Native perspective, definitely elevating our oral histories and our stories. Much of that through the years has kind of been interpreted through a lens of colonization that really doesn't give the public a whole picture of our history and our contemporary issues. So in our state of California, we have 109 federally recognized tribes and 81 tribes seeking federal recognition. So we have a lot of tribes and a very large Native American population. And in the area that I'm from, which is Sonoma County, we have 3 counties, Sonoma, Mendocino, and Lake counties. And within that, we have 24 Pomo and Miwok tribes, and I am related to several of those. That was a picture of my grandmother from the Big Valley Reservation in Lake County. In terms of building resiliency for our community, we've got a lot of need. We're located in what most of the world knows as wine country. It's Pomo country, but most of the world knows it as wine country. And it's a very expensive place to live. So for our people to be able to, live and work in their ancestral territory can be quite a bit of a financial struggle. We have 19.6% of our Native individuals in our county who are below the poverty level. 40% of them earning less than 40,000. 40,000 doesn't go a long way when you have to spend the majority of that on housing, which is quite expensive in our region. We also have issues with Native American student achievement. We have about 22% of our Native youth who drop out of school for many reasons, a lot related to curriculum and a sense of feeling marginalized within the school system. And we have 18% of them who are prepared for college. So we really have to increase our student achievement gaps. And then we have a high mortality rate. A lot of that, we suffered quite a bit during the pandemic, but beyond that, we have a lot of dietary related diseases, especially diabetes, cancer, heart disease. So in terms of serving our community, we are very focused on creating resources and direct services. And we do that, we address that in many ways. We have a tribal youth ambassadors program, which really looks at college readiness and closing that achievement gap. We have a gift store, which raises the visibility of our tribal culture and creates business opportunities for local people. Our Native youth have a social enterprise called Acorn Bites, which we sell to the public. We process our traditional acorns, creating acorn flour, and create an opportunity to have more of traditional food product that's available for our daily lives. In addition to that, we are working on our cooling center through developing our resilience hub and providing disaster relief services. So we have had issues around wildfires. We've had 2 very significant fires. We've had nearly 7 days of the power outages. We have very poor air qualities not only when our area is on fire, but other parts of California, which have been happening pretty much annually. And then with COVID, we provide cash assistance and traditional foods and medicines. We're working on creating a food hub as part of our museum so that we can support traditional food vendors. And we also have a cultural arts program called Healing Through Cultural Arts, which really helps our community not only learn traditional arts to create beautiful products of our culture, but also to process historical trauma and contemporary trauma related to fires and pandemics and climate emergencies. So we keep pretty busy with our direct services, and our goal is really to build a resilient infrastructure. We installed a rooftop solar array. We're working on our battery system. We're working with Nate on that installation. We have 24,000 square feet, and our goal is to be able to be open for at least 72 hours during an emergency, so that we can continue to provide those direct services to people in our community. During the first fire in 2017, we actually didn't know if our building was there for several days. And when we did get access, we had many of our neighbors and families and their pets kind of camped out in our parking lot. And so we just naturally started providing direct services. But through that, we've also discovered that our tribal community members were not really accessing emergency services in the routine places that they were available. And so we really started looking at how we could create more of an equitable distribution of resources, since we have a long history in our community, have built up trust within our community, and had many community members coming to us looking for resources. We conducted a community assessment in 2019 so that as we were building out our resilience hub, we were prioritizing what the needs identified by our community members were. And many of our community members really prioritize traditional food as a way to build resiliency, but also mitigate the impacts of climate change. Without giving you too much of a history lesson on California, California doesn't have treaties like tribes you would find in other Western states. Our treaties were negotiated but never ratified and put into an injunction of secrecy during the gold rush. So had they been ratified, we would have 7.5 million acres of Indian land in California, which would have been stewarded with traditional ecological knowledge and probably would not have succumbed to the wildfire crisis because of our indigenous fire ecology and other methods. But now we have very little land, and among the 109 tribes, there's less than 500,000 acres that are within tribal jurisdictions. So a lot of our gathering, harvesting, all of those things often have to take place on private lands of other people, or within county or state park systems, and it creates a hindrance. So our community is really focused on how we build resiliency through food sovereignty, how we can steward our lands, apply traditional ecological knowledge, and be able to have traditional foods that are not only more healthy to combat dietary related diseases, but also help us combat climate change. And so our findings from our community were really about how we do that. And additionally, our community wanted to look at how we as a whole could reduce our carbon footprints and be able to provide services to our community during grid shutdowns, where we saw many of our folks who had medical devices really suffer during those long-term power outages. So our Native people are at risk in terms of these crises that keep happening, and we're vulnerable. The blackouts were nearly 7 days, and they were particularly hard on our tribal community members, especially elders who had health problems. And we have obviously a disproportionate amount of elders who are represented who have medical devices and health needs that are difficult to serve during a blackout. We have high rates of asthma, heart conditions, other chronic diseases. There is a tremendous need for clean air. We have had weeks at a time where we couldn't even really see the sun outside because the smoke was so thick. So those things really exacerbate a lot of those issues. Within our needs assessment and the direct services, our cash service program, we have a lot of requests for people who need assistance with their utilities. And so a lot of folks can't afford the costs of air conditioning if they have access to it. And it's really critical that when the grid does go down, that we're able to stay connected. A lot of our tribal folks, when they lose internet service or can't charge their phones, they can't ask for help. And so we don't have a lot of our tribal community members that are currently using solar and battery storage. And so our focus has also been on how we can educate our tribal families so that they can obtain it, as well as funding. So our tribal people definitely need access to resources, access to traditional foods. We see that this extreme heat and drought is impacting our traditional food systems. A lot of our work is also focused on policy because if we gather our traditional foods on public lands without a permit, it's a $1,000 fine and a potential misdemeanor. So being able to project a certain window of time when we can get traditional foods for a 24-hour permit is very difficult because of climate change, and it's changed the times when things are in season and available to harvest. we have a tremendous amount of toxins that are caused by the fire, as well as pesticides. So we're always tracking and mapping where it's safe to gather traditional foods. And we know that the warming of the ocean is impacting our abalone, our salmon, among other things. So we don't have the access that we used to because of climate change. So how do we build resilience? We've done that through creating an infrastructure within our buildings so that we can serve the needs of our community through traditional food vendors, supporting folks to create that as a business opportunity, as well as being able to be open and provide direct services during an emergency. So we have done our solar rooftop array. We're in the midst of permitting right now for our battery storage. We replaced all of our HVAC. That took about a year to get the unit shipped. So the pandemic definitely delayed a lot of our installation. We're in the midst of planning for our traditional food incubator and really just working towards how we can provide services when our folks are in need. We've had some challenges along the way. One was how we got our Resilience Hub designation. That was kind of during the process of building our Resilience Hub. But we worked closely with our local county supervisor's office in being able to obtain that. And a lot of kind of extracurricular, I guess, policy advocacy work on the local level, I think helped support that process. Our battery contracting and funding was kind of the last piece that we put together, and that was difficult as well in terms of trying to size the battery and find a contractor who was willing to install it. We had some starts and stops around that, and then additionally, the battery was more expensive than we had anticipated. So we had to raise additional funding along the way in order to be able to afford the system and buy it outright. The self-generation incentive program, last year when we had hoped to install our battery, it ran out of funding. So luckily the timing has worked that the program has been refunded, and we're working with AMS to get that application completed. It's definitely a technical application that we needed support to complete. Permitting has always been an issue around the timing and wondering when it's going to be going through the process. So we've had some delays there, but so far so good. We've had equipment delays, trying to locate equipment or ship equipment during the pandemic has been a problem. Things have started to get better. Creating partnerships, especially around emergency relief, have been a little bit of an issue. What we often find is there's a bit of cultural taxation when it comes to having to educate partners about our tribal community members and how best to meet their needs. So we work quite a bit on establishing those relationships over the long term and outreaching to our tribal community to make sure that they're informed about other resources that they can access. In planning our battery needs, we had to do a lot of soul searching, in a sense, forecasting about what we were going to need to use, what parts of the building we were going to need to use during an emergency. And we struggled with that a bit because every emergency, while we've experienced 3 or 4 now, have been very different. Even the fires have been very different, depending on their proximity to your home or their proximity to our facility, on what kind of staff we can pull into the facility if their home is in danger, those types of things. So we did a lot of talking around what those needs might be and how best to use our resources during those times. But understanding that every experience, every event is very fluid and different, makes you also have to plan for things that perhaps haven't happened yet. So with that, I hope it gives you a good idea around our experience and what has motivated us to become a resilience and cooling center, and how we've gone about pursuing that designation and process. Feel free to contact me at any time. This is my email and contact information. I'm always happy to help and support anyone else's efforts in doing the same and serving their community. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nikki, and thanks to all of our presenters. We unfortunately don't really have a ton of time for questions, but I'll just ask one quick one, and thankfully, if folks need to hop off, that's totally fine. But just to all of you, one question that did come in is, what are kind of the requirements that folks should be considering if they want to become a cooling center, beyond just the air conditioning, air filtration, all of that? And then how should they be considering that increased energy load, so having to run an air conditioner, HVAC, whatever, to having a affordable solar and storage system?
Nate, I don't know. There we go. Nate's still on the line. I think he might be the go-to here to answer that one.
Yeah, so the starting point for most facilities is that they already have air conditioning. And so we don't normally see people installing new air conditioning systems to become a cooling center. They just use what they already have. So their existing usage is a pretty good baseline for what they would need to use during an outage. Right? So as long as we have a baseline like that, we can go forward and plan what we need to plan. If you were going to install new systems, then we can also estimate what the power consumption of those systems would be. So let's say you didn't have really effective cooling in a facility, or you only had one big centralized system that was maybe inefficient, and you were going to install mini splits because you have 2 rooms, and that's the only thing you want to use as a cooling center. That's the most efficient way to get from here to there. We can help you understand how much energy would you expect to use during an outage, right? Given a certain number of degrees outside, et cetera, like how much would you expect to use, and then base your system planned off that. In all cases, if you're trying to go for the most cost-effective system, again, the idea is to reduce load to only exactly what you need, right? That always gives you the most cost-effective system, whether it's from efficiency measures or from just shedding loads that already exist within the building.
Great, thanks, Nate. And Nikki, I wonder if you could just speak to CIMCC's experience with figuring out like getting a new HVAC and all of that, and how you weighed those priorities versus, the needs of your community.
Yeah, it's been a long time planning. We before we could even do the HVAC renovation and install the solar, we had to get a new roof. And so that was costly. And fortunately, we were able to seek funding for that. A lot of the funding in our nonprofit world is more about programs than it is about capital and infrastructure. So it took some time to, as well as kind of shifting from a lot of federal funding that we were relying on, and going into the private sector and building up relationships. So it was first the roof, and then knowing that we needed to do the HVAC upgrade, we pursued that, but the solar actually came in first because the HVAC got delayed in shipping, and took probably 7 more months than we thought. So it was okay because our HVAC followed the same kind of footprint that it had pre-existed on. So we were able to do that. And yeah, a lot of it was kind of having to do it as it came and kind of shifting strategies and priorities based on the challenges that were out there as well.
And if I could add to that, just based on the way the supply chain is right now, if you were a facility and you decided you're going to become a cooling center and you're going to install resilient power, then I would not expect that whole process to be done in less than a year, which sounds like a crazy long time to be waiting for things. But when the battery by itself takes 6 months and you have questions you have to answer on interconnection, the process just takes quite a long time. And so having having some help either from the installer themselves or from someone else, like to help shepherd that process, is really important to keeping things on track.
Yeah, and I think too, from a nonprofit side of finding the funding and not wanting to do the contract till you know the funding's in place, but then understanding all the time it takes to actually get it installed, and wanting to be able to spend your funding within a certain framework. Some of that has kind of, we've had to, do extensions and things like that. So understanding that that might be an issue from the beginning too, I think is good to forecast.
Great, thank you all so much. Apologies to everyone whose questions we did not get to. We do have them, and we'll be sure to try and answer them in the follow-up emails if we can. Thank you all for staying over time, and yeah, thanks again for joining us for this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.